All right. Seems like a lot of you are finishing up, so like I said before, what we typically do when we're discussing literature is we come back together at the end so that we make sure that everybody's clear. Before we go through that debrief, since this is the first time we're trying this, did this help you navigate your way through the paper? Yes. Okay. It's already posted, but there's a article called Henry et al. You can look in the schedule and see when it's due, but you can also look in the schedule and see when the introduction is due and when the methods and results are due. Read the description of the literature summary in the syllabus, and it tells you kind of how you should be preparing all of that. We'll talk about that a little more as you prepare. When you open up the Henry et al. Paper for the first time, we're hoping that this template for how you can go about approaching a paper will be useful for you in approaching the other papers you will have to read this semester. That was the whole purpose of doing this. Because it is challenging to read scientific literature for the first time. And you're just going to read more and more as you go on. Yeah?
So are we going to have to write it out like for other articles?
No, this is just to get you introduced to the idea. But if you found it helpful to think about this paper that way, you might find it helpful to think about other papers in this way. Keep in mind that this is a nature paper, so it's structured a little differently. Normally we think of papers as having an intro, a methods, a results section, and a discussion section. But science and nature papers are oftentimes done differently. This one, not so much because it's old, it's 1994, but like the modern ones, the methods don't even appear in the bulk of the article. It appears as footnotes in Nature. And so you sometimes have to rearrange how you think about the structure of the paper as you go through and read it. Does anybody have any questions? Is there anything that you didn't understand as you read through the paper? Did us going through the exercise, looking at the proofs before you read this, did that help you understand the paper?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Good. We're not going to do that for the next paper. So you need to start on the next paper reading it early enough that as you have questions, almost every day we'll come in and the first thing that comes out of Dr. Juttermeyer's mouth is, does anybody have any questions? Well, oftentimes we're asking about the stuff that we covered in the last period, but if you've started reading the Henry et al. Paper and you have some questions, raise your hand and get those questions answered there, because better to get those questions answered earlier rather than later. We're going to have one more, before we get to the Henry et al. Paper, we're going to look at one other paper that's going to be similar to this one in that it's in that science nature format. And then most of the rest of the semester will be in the IMRAD, intro, methods, and all discussion format. So I'm hopeful that what we normally do is our first walkthrough of the paper, but this semester is our second, will go even better because you guys had this first, so you get more practice before we get to the first lecture summary. Yeah. It's like everything else. The more practice you get with something, the better off you are. Those of you who are athletes, do you just show up on game day having not practiced the previous week? Yeah, you've been through this speech already. No, you practice on a daily basis. The way you get good at reading literature is by practicing the art of reading literature. So that's why we're doing this. So we have the coots. They're colorful, strange, the coloration, because the adults, where are the adults? The adults are not colored this way. There we go. The adults are not colored this way. So they thought up this experiment to test parental favoritism. They manipulated the feathers because it's just this end of the feather that has the orange coloration. I find it productive. I taught this case study for 15 years before I finally just made a graphic that illustrates what the controls are. So we have the orange controls, the black controls, and then the experimental broods. sometimes stuff like this helps me just think through what the deal is that's going on. In the same way that Dr. Judd suggested in this exercise, that you might make a flow chart of the methods. If parental favoritism is a thing, black coots and orange coots in these broods will be different. But if parental favoritism is a thing, the black and the orange broods here would be essentially not different because there's no basis for favoritism. Everybody's black or everybody's orange.
Or any favoritism that is there would be very hard to detect and measure with the tools that we use to measure.
Yeah. So then we went through this exercise the other day, last Friday, where we actually predicted what the data would look like if the hypothesis of parental favoritism is correct. When you design your experiment in lab, it's going to be very useful for you to think before you ever go and do the experiment, if I do this experiment and these are my response variables, what do I expect the data to look like if my preferred explanation for what's going on is the truth versus if that idea is not correct? So doing these types of exercises where you project into the future, what would I expect to find if X is true versus if X is false? Then when you get the data, it's really easy to see, oh, X is true or X is false. So this act of predicting the data without seeing the data is actually super, super important. They divided, well, the coots themselves divide the brood. The mother coot and the father coot care for different subsets of each brood. And these broods, these chicks are what they call asynchronous layers. They lay one egg one day, then they lay another egg, then they lay another egg the third day, then an egg the fourth day. And so the hatching order becomes important. Clearly, the first couple of chicks don't experience a lot of favoritism because there's not a lot to compare to. This favoritism affects the later chicks more so than the earlier chicks because the opportunity for choice in the parents is more pronounced when there are more chicks there. Did you notice how they write their captions? I called attention to it in the exercise. Did you pay attention to the writing in the captions? This is something that our students struggle with sometimes, but captions actually are really simple once you kind of learn what they're about. This caption, first thing is it tells you which figure it is. In this paper, it's the third figure. Then it has a title. Now, in this case, the title is a long title. The relationship between hatching day and survival of orange chicks and black chicks within experimental broods. Is that a sentence? Why not? What?
It doesn't have like a verb.
Who is that? Oh, I can't see your mouth moving because you have a mask on it. It doesn't have a verb. The verb is not written and it's not implied. That is not a sentence. That's a title. That's a noun. It's just a really long multi-word noun. So a caption has three components: a figure or table number, a title, and then an explanation as to what's in there. So this is the figure number, this is the title, and then all the rest of this is explanation. And in that explanation, they're explaining to you what's going on in the figure. They even have statistical results of the tests that they ran on the data that tell them that the data mean the thing that they think that the data means. And so I think students struggle with writing captions because they don't break it down simply enough. Figure number, title, explanation. But it's actually pretty simple. You can get confused sometimes in what you need to write in an explanation, but you need to write in an explanation whatever is necessary for the reader to understand what that figure or table means. And sometimes that can be really short, sometimes that can be quite long. It just depends on what's required of a given figure or table.
And that description is a standalone thing, right? So there's several figures in the paper, each showing some pattern, maybe with a statistical test in there. If you put all those together, you've got the collection of patterns that help them make their argument. But each one is standalone.
There's actually a paper that I use in my CTI class, my level 2 CTI class, and I give the class just the figures. And from the figures, they have to figure out what the paper is about, what the experiment was, how the experiment was structured and all that. And you can gain all of that from just these 3 figures that are in this paper. So, questions about this? Yep, go ahead.
No, you're good. You can keep going. I'm just putting a graphic of what you just described.
I think I'm done.
Good.
What is Dr. Jeff drawing?
Just the structure that you just described.
This happens in team teaching. The other professor just starts doing stuff and you don't know where he's going. Oh, gotcha. Oh, he's just drawing what I described. We're going to talk a lot about writing because being able to communicate both written and in an oral presentation is super important in science. So we're going to be talking about the structure of writing and stuff like that. You're going to talk way more about writing than you ever thought you were going to talk about writing in a science class. If your papers are unstapled, make sure your name is on all the copies of them, and just set them on this table on your way out. Homework assignment is on Moodle. It deals with statistics. It requires that you have a deck of cards. There are multiple decks of cards that will be outside my office door in about 10 minutes. Yes, ma'am.
I don't have, right now, I don't have a laptop,
Okay.
because I can't connect it to the Wi-Fi, I put in a ticket,